I'm 28 years old, born and raised in Oakland, California, currently living in Washington, D.C. Both my parents are Eritrean, so I identify as Eritrean-American.
Obviously, we're talking about the word HABESHA today. So what does the word HABESHA mean to you?
I feel like I've had like a complex relationship with the word as I've grown older. You know, if I try to like recall from like my childhood, I don't really recall my parents ever using the term as an identifier for us. And they've always kind of emphasized, you know, that we're Eritrean, but they've never had opposition to the term either. So when referring to things, the term was casually used, but I feel like I was always reminded like, oh, you're Eritrean. I feel like from a young age, I would say I'm Eritrean. And when people ask like, oh, what's that? Oh, it's a country. It's in East Africa. It borders Ethiopia. That's kind of how it went. But I think as I got a little bit older, like let's say like middle school, I mean, there's a sizable Eritrean and Ethiopian community in the Bay Area, as you know. But like the schools that I went to, for example, were like predominantly white. And if there were any other Ethiopian or Eritrean students, you know, we obviously gravitate to each other because of our similar like upbringing and cultural experiences. In those settings, the term Habesha was used. Like, oh, are you Habesha? Instead of asking, are you from Eritrea or Ethiopia? Mm-hmm. I don't know if it's something out of just like convenience so you don't mistake one for the other. But I always knew how I identified. I identified as Eritrean. If someone asked if I'm Habesha, I would say, yeah, I'm Habesha. I'm from, like, my parents are from Eritrea. But I do like recall like my parents explaining at some point that like Habesha isn't the most inclusive term for in the context of Eritrea. Mm-hmm. And so, and as I grew older and I learned more about the many different ethnic backgrounds of Ethiopia as well, I also realized like, oh, the term might not also be super inclusive, because I think there was a point where I just thought anybody from Eritrea, anybody from Ethiopia, you know, fall under that umbrella. So when I got older and I started to realize like, oh, if it's not the most inclusive term, I don't think it's right to like use it as something that, you know, as an identifier. But I didn't think there was anything like wrong with using the term. And I think that kind of changed maybe when I was like in undergrad and I started to learn more about like, the activism going on in Ethiopia and like learning about like the different ethnic divides that exist there and realizing that the term isn't the most inclusive in their context either. Yeah, at that point moving forward, I kind of, again, didn't have like a strong feeling towards the term, but also was a little bit more mindful when talking to people. I don't know if I've struggled with it because my parents definitely like emphasized and reminded us like of our Eritrean identity and how our history shapes our communities and why it's important to let people know whether they're Ethiopian, whether they're Eritrean, whether they're, you know, from anywhere in the world that we're Eritrean. So
I thought it was really interesting that your family pointed out that it wasn't an inclusive term. Like, do you mind, or like if you can recall, like what exactly they talked about, like in that sense, and like how they presented that to you, what age you were?
You know, like the Eritrean saying, like, Hada Hisbi, Hada Libby, or Hada Libby, Hada Hisbi. I think my dad very much so emphasized to us that like, as Eritreans, we're not to define ourselves by the ethnicity that we come from, but by our nationality. That's something that I recall being emphasized in my younger years. He explained that like the term itself doesn't capture the 9 ethnic groups of Eritrea. And because of that, it's a kind of an othering term. But that's, again, still coming from the perspective of someone from the Tigrinya ethnic group. I didn't hear that from someone who came from another ethnic group of Eritrea. So I never really knew how other Eritreans who were not Tigrinya speaking identified. So I just kind of took that as, well, if it's a non-inclusive term, maybe it is something that everyone agrees upon that it's non-inclusive. But again, I feel like my perspective was only informed by my parents and who are Tigrinya. In Oakland, like I said, there's like a sizable community of both Eritreans and Ethiopians. And I remember in middle school, like my best friend, she's Ethiopian. So then I met like, you know, her family, her cousins, her friends. But again, they were all Amhara. So my understanding of Ethiopian identity from like the outside looking in was from a very like Amhara-centric viewpoint. I wasn't even like really aware that like the Oromo people make up the majority of Ethiopia's population till I was like in college, because up until that point, I had never met anyone who was Oromo. That, for example, is something that like kind of shifted when I got to college, and I started meeting, Ethiopians from various ethnic backgrounds. But I do recall, like in undergrad, there were not a lot of Ethiopians and Eritreans at my school at the time. And I noticed that there was like a lot more that started going when I graduated. I have a younger cousin who just graduated from the same university this year, and they had a really sizable Eritrean and Ethiopian student organization that didn't exist when I was in undergrad. We kind of had one, and I do recall like us pushing for like it not to be called a Habesha student union or a Habesha club, because we recognize that that is not inclusive. And I think, when the organization was started, it was under the name of like Eritrean Ethiopian Student Association or whatever the club name was. So that was, I think, at that time, I was very much so aware that like the term might not be the most inclusive, although the people who were in the club would, I guess, quote unquote, fall under a category of Habesha. However, that may be defined as like we were all Amhara or all Tigrinya or Amhara students. So
Gotcha. I agree. I think it's crazy how much the organizations have grown in the past few years, and I think hopefully that also allows more spaces for conversations like this, especially as like conflict arises back home. Hopefully people have the space to talk through it more in person here. Going back to, your best friend was Amara, and like obviously that's a very dominant culture in Ethiopia, and I would say like in like what's Habesha, like what has been your interaction with, if you've had much exposure to other Eritreans?
Yeah, I'm gonna be honest, I feel like I haven't. Like I feel like over the years I've met people who might say like, oh, I'm like, my mom is from Keren and she's Blen. Maybe some people who may be mixed with Tigray or something. But kind of going back to like what my dad kind of emphasized when we were growing up was that like regardless like what language you speak in Eritrea, you're Eritrean, they're Eritrean. In order to, unify us, you have to see each other all as equals. Kind of like the perspective I grew up under.
And have you ever talked about like specifically its meaning? Have you ever discussed its origin? Like what is your knowledge about the word, if any?
I've always just been curious about who originally, like, I know that there's ties to like older kingdoms that also encapsulate like Yemen and what's current day Eritrea, what's current day Ethiopia. I'm actually very curious of like the history and like when people started to use the word as an identifier. I feel like my information is very limited on the historical part of it. So,
would you say that you identify as Habesha, like as a blanket statement?
No, I don't. And I think I still loosely use the term, but like to identify, like to self-identify, I don't use it. I won't like, again, like if someone asks me that question, are you Habesha? I usually follow up with, yeah, I'm Eritrean, just to like clarify where I'm from, because that question in itself just assumes like, okay, you're either from Eritrea or Ethiopia. And then I would follow up with, clarifying where I'm from, where my family's from. So yeah, that happens a lot in DC. And like, yeah, it's sometimes, it happens every single day in an Uber. And then they get mad. I can't speak Amharic, but I'm like, well, there's many different languages spoken between the two countries. And you know what I get sometimes? When I'll say like, oh, well, I'm Eritrean, I speak Tigrinya. They're like, well, but you live in DC. I'm like, okay. Like, usually it doesn't like stress me out, or I don't like, because I know that like, and also there's a generational divide too, maybe with like the term, or like obviously like our identity based off of like what experiences you've lived through, where you come from. But
yeah, like I guess to go off of that, like how many times have you been back to Eritrea, if any?
I've been back 4 times. I actually just was there in January, like end of December, beginning of January. I'm trying to like recall, like people say like Habesha Kadan rather than like Tzara Kadan, or like referring to like cultural clothes. And I feel like I've heard that term used both in Eritrea and outside of Eritrea.
Just like when I've researched the way it's used in Ethiopia, I've seen it used for like a number of different businesses. Like I feel like Ethiopians are very much like, we are Habesha, and like it seems to be a very strong thing, especially in Addis.
No, I think it would be really interesting to hear. And maybe through your interviews, if you talk to people who are born in Eritrea, born in Ethiopia, then like maybe you might have a little bit of a glimpse of like their experiences with the words. But obviously that's a point of your whole project, you know, to get that perspective from different individuals here in the diaspora.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, I'm doing a lot of research, and I'm trying to be selective in what I say too, because I don't want it to like impact your answers too much. And I hope like the actual, you know, initial exhibit could be kind of a culmination, and people can see how their narrative fits into it. Okay, next question. Would you say that you think about the word often?
That's a good question. Do I think about the word often? I think that there was a point where I was like at conflict with the term, because I felt like I used it so regularly at a point in time. And then kind of as I've shifted that perspective and understood like how it may not be the most inclusive, I was more mindful of, you know, when I do reference anything related to Ethiopia or Eritrea and our identities. But I feel like these days, I don't think about it as often, especially like in this time when there's just like so much conflict, and a lot of that conflict does involve ethnic lines. I also always want to be really mindful of like not using a term that someone may not, you know, identify with, and just if they identify by their ethnicity versus their nationality.
I really love that answer, because I feel like like kind of what you were saying earlier, the way that you're coming at it from a different direction of just like asking someone in more broad terms, like how do you identify, and letting them choose the terminology. So I really like that answer. Like when you think of a Habesha look, like what type of look comes to mind for you, or like even culturally, like what are things that are like defined and pronounced for you?
I think that's a good question, because it does, you know, touch upon like what someone might phenotypically think of someone from Eritrea, Ethiopia. Typically falls into appearance, or how someone who is Tigrinya or Amhara or Tigray may look. When if you think about it, like both countries have, you know, so many more different ethnic groups, so many different skin tones and hair textures. And just like physical appearances. But like, I think when you say Habesha, it usually goes back to, I guess, the phenotype of like Tigrinya people, Tigray people, Amhara people. But that kind of also just ties into the fact that if you're using the term to capture all of, Habesha just Eritrean and Ethiopians, but when you think of the term Habesha, there are, you know, so many more. And if you think of it as like an umbrella term for Eritrea and Ethiopia, I don't think doing it service, because it doesn't cover the various ethnic groups of both countries. When you say Habesha, I typically think of like someone who's, Tigrinya or Amhara or Tigray, but that's not inclusive of like both countries. So if you use it as a term for Eritrea and Ethiopia, but you're only thinking of the appearance of like 3 ethnic groups, then I feel like it's not, an inclusive term.
I think it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? Because like when you leave your country, like you need to find a way to connect with your people. And obviously, like if you're Eritrean, you're not going to be like, oh, those are Ethiopians, I'm not going to hang out with them. Like it's like, no, we're all Habesha. Like I don't know where I'm going. Do you know where you're going? Like you're going to connect with people. So I think it's been a really great community builder in that sense. And obviously, like, our history is inextricably linked with Ethiopia and with Abyssinia, Aksum, etc. But then how that word is used to then create divisions in some sense, like whether it's ethnically or physically or religiously even though there are Muslims in all of the tribes as well, is something I'm always interested in talking more about. Before we head into the second tier of the conversation, like, would you have any other like thoughts or ideas to add of just like how this word is used within our community? I know like you've kind of already touched upon it like since the beginning of the conversation, but if you had any last thoughts before we moved on.
The more that like we're talking about this, I'm also just like really curious of like, the perspective of other individuals, maybe if they're from Tigray versus an Amhara person, and also like what the word means to someone who doesn't choose to identify by their nationality versus like their ethnicity, and what that word means to them. That's actually something that I've been very curious about, just like given like what's been going on and in Eritrea and Ethiopia. But I always look at it as a number game because their population is so much larger and each ethnic group within that country just like has a larger number of people. Like I understand, or I can see why, like, you know, being very connected to your ethnic background when your ethnicity has been, you know, through a lot of things, like, then yeah. So
how has you identifying as Habesha impacted your relationship with other Africans? Like, do they have a lot of questions? Have they made comments about your community or about the way that the term is used? Like, how has that experience been like?
I think that, so I have a lot of friends from a lot of different African countries, West Africa, Southern Africa, East Africa, other places in East Africa. And I think that, like, from their perspective, sometimes, like, because we use the word and, like, we have explained, like, oh, like, loosely it refers to, you know, people from either Eritrea, Ethiopia. That's kind of how they identify us. They must be Habesha. Like, I can tell because they look like you. I think, like, a lot of my African friends, like, they are aware that, like, you know, there are two separate countries with many different identities, but they still, like, will say, like, oh, like, I met someone who was Habesha last night, like, you know, so-and-so. And it's like, it's not, like, I feel like in those situations, I don't think I usually, like, get at them, like, wait, but were they Eritrean? Were they Ethiopian? Like, Habesha is not an inclusive term because I think for them, their understanding is just very much so, like, more broad. I mean, depending on the relationships I have with people, like, I have some, like, really close friends who are Nigerian, and they're very, very well aware of, like, politics and history of Eritrea and Ethiopia, and are also mindful of the fact that, like, not everyone identifies as Habesha. So, like, when they do encounter someone who they suspect is from Eritrea, Ethiopia, they're able to have a conversation about, like, oh, where are you from? Or, you know.
I think another conversation that I don't want to, like, force this conversation, but I do think it's worth bringing up just because of the prominence in popular culture, social media, is obviously this connection between East African girls and West African men. Like, what are your thoughts on that? And I'm just going to leave it at that. Like, have you seen this type of conversation on social media? Have you had conversations about this with your circles? And if so, like, what have your thoughts been?
It's something that's very much so, like, I don't know, at the forefront of, like, different conversations with, like, my friends that are Eritrean and Ethiopian. And, like, I wouldn't say it's a fetish. I don't know, because everyone is different and, you know, everyone has preferences and whatnot. But I, you know, definitely think there's this phenotype and there's this, like, look that when referring to Eritrean or Ethiopian women, you know, that, like, I have Nigerian friends who, like, are very attracted to women from our part of that continent. And I think that, like, I don't know. I wouldn't say it's a fetish, but, like, I have noticed, like not a trend. I don't know how to put it, but I have seen these conversations, have had these conversations, have noticed, like, the comments and the things that, you know, men from other parts of Africa have regarding this, like, phenotype of, like, oh, a Habesha woman looks like this with long curly hair and light skin. And
I guess, like, to that point, like, I've also been having these conversations with West African men. So you talked a lot about, like, how they will state these preferences and they'll, like, kind of pursue them openly. They'll tell us about them. But then, like, how would you say is, like, the East African girl, or rather, like, Habesha girl response to that? And, like, what have you seen in your circles?
I mean, just from, like, anecdotes, I've heard some of my East African, like, my Eritrean and Ethiopian girlfriends, you know, kind of bash on Eritrean and Ethiopian men and kind of been like, no, like, they're too skinny, their legs are too skinny, and, like, you know, I'm not, like, attracted to them, like, really attracted to. So it kind of goes both ways in some situations. I don't know how much, like, is influenced by, like, the media's perception of us and them and how that interacts, but definitely have, you know, I've seen it firsthand with, like, some friends, and yeah.
It's definitely interesting in that sense. And I've seen more East African men talk out about that on social media as well. Like, why do East African women hate on us? Yeah, I feel like it's kind of an awkward thing because I feel like it's really developed since, I mean, I think it's kind of been developing, like, honestly, ever since Drake said young East African girl has been over, like, we cannot rest. But I think since post-COVID, like there's just like West African and East African women, and like I feel like we're in a transitional phase where like people are kind of addressing it, but like not really, and like there are a lot of problematic things being said, and yeah, it's a conversation I'm keeping a pulse on. But I do feel like it's kind of like how do you say, like a rabbit hole in this Habesha conversation, because it goes back to like, well, like what is that phenotype, like why is that phenotype upheld? I think it's really interesting, kind of like those nuances. I'm kind of like regressing to that intra-community conversation, but like the nuances within that, because I feel like the Habesha phenotype is also so specific. Like I've talked about it with my family, where like from what I understand, Habesha people, or like Eritreans and Ethiopians, have never like fully aspire to be white, right? Like a lot of people are like, oh my God, you guys like look Eurocentric. But for our culture, it's like, well, we never wanted to be white. But then within our own beauty standards, it's like, okay, you need to be brown, but not too brown. You know, you need to have curly hair, but you can't be gorgeous. Like all these like parameters.
And I think that might have something to do with like the long standing colonial impact, whether like it's from the Ottomans or the Turks at one point, or Egyptians, and then the Italians. Like you have had a lot of interactions with a lot of different people from a lot of different parts of the world. And I think part of that may have like influenced like within our own communities, our perceptions of beauty. And I don't think that happened just when the Italians came.
That's a great point.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole, I mean, beauty standards within our communities and colorism within our communities, texturism. It's part, I think it's part of this conversation, because it has something to do with our identity as well. Even within families, like I'm significantly darker than my mom and a little darker than my sister. And like, just like comments I hear from my own family members about my skin tone and my hair texture. It's just, it's quite crazy.
Feel free to expand. I feel like I did want to touch more on that in the intra-community conversation, but I didn't want to like pressure you to feel like you have to say things that you don't want to share. But yeah, like if you want to speak on colorism and texturism, like please do.
I have a lot of family in Seattle from my mom's side that I don't see that often, and I just like will never forget like my uncle's wedding in like 2011 or 12 when I was in high school still, and my family hadn't seen me in like 4 or 5 years. They all just kept saying like, whoa, like, when did you get so dark? Or like, just like comments like that, and comparing me to my sister. And like, I left that wedding feeling like, this is supposed to be my family. These are like my like blood relative, or like, you know, part of my mom's like side of the family. And I was just kind of shocked that like, that was their takeaway when they saw me for the first time in years. Like, luckily I like grew up with a mom who always reminded me of my beauty, regardless of like what anyone would say about my skin color or my hair texture, which I'm very grateful for that. But just like, even like, very interesting. And I very much so love the skin I'm in, and I've never felt like insecure, because I also recognize that Eritrean people, Ethiopian people who fall under this Habesha umbrella, like we do come in like all different shades and hair textures. And something interesting I get like almost like not daily, but I get from a lot of like other Eritreans and Ethiopians that I look just like their cousin, just like their aunt, just like, and I've been getting that for like ever since I moved to DC. And I think that in a way I feel like, okay, well, although I've experienced some colorism or some texturism within my family, at least other people recognize that I do look like I am from where I'm from.
I think that's really interesting. I will say you do look really like similar to my aunt. Like one of my aunts, like you look so similar. It's kind of crazy.
You know, I get it often, and like the funny thing is I don't get it from like my non-East African friends. Like, you know how like sometimes someone might say like, oh, like all of you guys look the same, which maybe we have some defining characteristics, but like I always get from other Eritreans and Ethiopians that I look like someone they know very well, or their sister or cousin. Or
like, it's really disappointing to hear that you've experienced that, especially because like you're not, I mean, like, not to even like make this a justifiable claim, but like you're not even like a fraction of how dark an Eritrean can be, you know? Like, that's crazy. And I would say like I've had similar situations where it's very, like what you just said, it's very I guess, conditional, like person to person basis. Like within some of my family members, I'm darker. Within other people, I'm lighter. With some people, my hair is tight. With other people, my hair is loose. Similar situations in that sense. And then also, I think it's interesting, like, the way people want to police what being Habesha looks like. Because, like, here you are being told, like, you don't look Habesha, but then you go to DC and, like, you're being told you look Habesha. And similar for me, like, people in New York will tell me, like, oh, you're clearly East African. But it's, like, weird to have members of your own community try to tell you don't look like them. And, like, using often times that word, but also within, like, your family, it's just, like us. Even with some of my family, like, some of my family can get so pale, like, so pale. They're just light. And I'm like, damn, like, how are we in the same family?
Yeah. I mean, my mom is very, very, very fair. And, like, she's had very interesting experiences in the workplace. She's a nurse, and there's a lot of other Eritrean and Ethiopian nurses at her hospital. And she told me a story about, like, one day she was at the cafeteria eating alone, and there was, like, a group of Ethiopian nurses who were, like, talking shit about her. Like, they're like, why she keeps staring at us? Or, like, there's, like, you know, speaking Amharic, and the whole time she's sitting there, obviously can understand what they're saying. And then when they later found out that she, like, was Eritrean or Ethiopian or Eritrean, like, they were, like, so shook. It's interesting. Regardless, she's super, like, very proud to be Eritrean, very proud to be from, like, the part of Eritrea she's from. And, like, we all look different. But yeah, I think that Blackness has been put into question. The Black students, African-American, you know, students that I, like, grew up with used to, like, literally say, like, you're not actually Black. You guys speak a different language, you eat different foods, you don't look like it. And so, I mean, the thing is this, like, I grew up with, like, also parents who, for some context, my parents have been in this country for, like, a really long time. My dad's been here since 74. My mom since 80, 81. One thing that my parents also emphasized was that before anything in this country, like in America, like a cop isn't going to, like, pull you over and say, oh, well, but they're Eritrean, they're like from an African country. No, like, you're Black in this country. And so because I knew that, and I was always, like, you know, very, very much so aware of that, it was very hard to confront when other Black people would say, well, you're not Black. It's like, well, then what am I? I feel like I got that more from, like, Black Americans than from, like, other people from different African diaspora communities.
But then on the flip side, would you say that, like, how would you say Eritreans and Ethiopians in your life identify with the word Black, or, like, their relationship with that word?
I think my parents, I wouldn't say they're an exception, because I'm sure there are other Eritreans or Ethiopians that felt the same way as my parents. But I mean, from relatives to, yeah, just, like, people in our communities, it was very apparent that, like, this desire to distance from the term Black or the term, you know, being African-American in this country, which never really made sense to me even at a young age, because I'm like, we're from Africa and we're in America, duh, we're African-American, or, like, we're clearly Black. And, like, I don't know, my parents very much so, like, have always been like, if it wasn't for all of the sacrifices and you know, all of the things that, like, Black Americans have gone through over centuries, we wouldn't be in this country. So there's no reason to other them or, like, think that we're better than. But again, that's not the experience that, like, a lot of Eritrean and Ethiopians have. I mean, even, like, I had an aunt who told me that when she came to this country, I don't know if it was, like, through, like, the refugee resettlement organization, or, like, she was, you know, taking courses or just things about, like, American life, I guess part of, like, the transition process. And they very clearly told them, like, if you see a Black man walking down the street, walk to the other side or clutch your purse. And it's like, these are things that were told to them as they came to this country.
Wow.
And so that's, like, a concrete example of, like, this country, like, just, like, in its nature has, you know, a hate for Black people, even, like, when speaking to other Black people. So
that's insane. Yeah. When did she come here?
It's, like, in the 90s.
Wow.
Like, yeah.
You know, I'm amazed, for example, in Washington, D.C., when I walk around and I see Amharic everywhere. And, like, even though, you know, Ethiopians are very clearly part of the Black population, they're also very clearly catered to as a specific ethnic group. And so Obviously, like DC is such a unique case, but how would you say that you've seen that across the United States in terms of like Eritreans and Ethiopians, being able to meet their like quote unquote their own community's needs versus like operating within the wider Black community?
I think that, like you said, DC, I feel like is an exception. I think that Eritrean and Ethiopians here in DC have like made up a very important fabric of this city. I mean, I think the wave of migration started back like before the 80s and maybe in the 70s. Yeah, definitely in the 70s. And I think, from my experiences living in DC, also my experiences living in Oakland, like, whether that's through commerce and through businesses, I feel like Eritreans and Ethiopians have established, and like, even just like a small example, like through restaurants, and like, I see food as cultural diplomacy. So like the fact that, Eritreans and Ethiopian food is something that is identifiable by the wider audience is a way that like we have really established our place in our societies and our communities. The more I think about it, it's like growing up in Oakland, like in the East Bay at least, like there are a ton of Ethiopian and Eritrean owned restaurants. There's obviously like notable Eritrean Ethiopians in media, in sports, in politics that have like been able to, further their passions and make an impact, but also like be really proud about like where they come from. And I think a lot of times when Eritrean and Ethiopians, I think there's like an element of like, I don't know, there's like a lot of pride in sports or as an actor or an actress or comedian, like very much so still make it known a little bit about their culture and stuff in the midst of like, their craft and what they bring to the world. So I think that's a powerful thing too.
I guess as we kind of wrap up, who would you say are like the Ethiopians and Eritreans that you think are, I don't even want to say like the most famous ones, but I think the ones that you think are making the biggest impact right now?
Well, like, we know that, like, rest in peace, Nipsey Hussle. I would say that, like, I think, because I grew up in the Bay, but then went to college in LA when he was coming up, like, as an artist. And I think that, like, he was a huge symbol to so many different communities. And he was someone that made it very clear that, like, his cultural identity has played a huge role in his mentality and just, like, the way that he sees the world. So definitely him. Haben Girma, who was like first deaf-blind graduate of Harvard Law School, which I think she's been able to use her, platform in a way that's super positive in the sports world. I think his name is Alexander Isaac.
Yes. Oh my God. He's like on every Eritrean page. They love him.
Yeah. Soccer is something that like actually unites the entire world. Like, every corner of the earth loves soccer. Maybe not America as much, but yes, being like an Eritrean who's like on one of those like big name, I don't know football, soccer like that, but yeah, I don't know by names, but I know cycling is so big in Eritrea now, and like they're making a name for themselves on a global stage.
Final question is, how would you like to see the Habesha or Eritrean identity expand in the public eye in the coming years?
That's a big question. I don't know. The first thing I think of is just like, I wish and I hope that like there will be a time where there are more spaces for people to engage in, meaningful conversations that really address and understand like all the challenges that affect our communities in a way that's healthy and productive, because that's not typically the case in our communities at all. I feel like people are very polarized, but there's also a lot of people who are just stuck and confused and don't know where to go for information or for community. And like, if we're able to like unite more and have more spaces for that, then potentially like that will allow us to, for others to like learn more about our communities in a positive light. Thank you so much. This was really great.